Jonathan Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the narrow country road wound deeper into the woods. The cold wind howled against his car, carrying whispers of unease through the cracks of his barely shut window. He had been to countless remote areas in his career as a veterinarian, tending to animals that were often overlooked by their owners. Tonight, however, felt different. There was a stillness to the air, broken only by the faint, eerie hum of cicadas. As he drove, his headlights caught the outline of an old, dilapidated house. It sat hunched at the edge of the forest, its wooden boards weathered and sagging, the kind of place that had long since been abandoned by anything resembling humanity. Jonathan didn't mean to slow down, but something about the place demanded his attention. He squinted, catching a faint glimmer of light through a crack in one of the windows. It wasn't the glow of a lamp or a candle. It flickered irregularly, almost alive. His heart quickened. He debated for a moment, his mind pulling between the instincts that had saved his skin in the past and the gnawing curiosity that was now clawing at him. Finally, he eased the car to a stop a safe distance away. Grabbing the flashlight from his glove compartment, he stepped out into the cold. The forest loomed tall and silent around him, and each step on the gravel felt deafening. As he approached the house, the glimmer of light seemed to shift, as though reacting to his presence. He pushed open the rusted gate, its screech cutting through the stillness. The porch groaned beneath his boots, and when he reached for the doorknob, the door gave way without resistance. Inside, the air was thick with a smell Jonathan couldn't immediately place. Something metallic, almost like blood, mixed with damp wood. The house was a wreck, with furniture overturned and walls covered in stains that had faded to brown. His flashlight beam swept across the room, catching fragments of broken glass and discarded tools. Then he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, a whimper, soft and trembling. It wasn't human, not entirely, but it wasn't animal either. It was something in between, something frightened and small. Jonathan froze, his hand tightening around the flashlight. "Hello?" he called, his voice steady but low. The whimper stopped. He waited, the silence stretching out like a held breath. Then, faintly, it came again, this time accompanied by the rattle of chains. Jonathan followed the sound down a narrow hallway, his pulse pounding. The door at the end was slightly ajar, and the light he'd seen from outside now spilled out into the corridor. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sight before him made him stop cold. A girl, no, a young woman, was curled in the corner of the room, shackled to the wall by a thick iron chain. Her clothes were torn, little more than rags, and her skin was streaked with dirt and bruises. But what caught Jonathan's attention most were her eyes. They glowed faintly, an ethereal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her shallow breaths. Her hair, though tangled and matted, shimmered as though catching light from an unseen source. She shrank back as his flashlight beam fell on her, raising a trembling hand as if to shield herself. Her lips moved, but the sounds that escaped weren't words, not in any language Jonathan recognized. He lowered the flashlight, softening its beam. "It's okay," he said gently, kneeling down to her level. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her glowing eyes locked onto his, wide with fear. Then, just as he was about to take another step closer, the sound of heavy boots thudding against the floorboards echoed through the house. Jonathan turned just as a hulking figure appeared in the doorway. The man was large, his face shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence radiated menace. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" the man growled, his voice low and dangerous. Jonathan stood, instinctively placing himself between the man and the girl. I saw the light," he stammered, quickly regaining his composure. "I thought the place was abandoned." The man stepped further into the room, his boots crunching against the debris on the floor. He looked past Jonathan, his eyes narrowing on the girl. "She's not your concern," he said coldly. "Get out." Jonathan's mind raced. The girl's trembling grew more pronounced, and he could feel her fear like a tangible weight in the room. His training as a veterinarian kicked in when faced with a frightened animal. Stay calm, don't make sudden movements, and don't provoke the aggressor. "I didn't mean to intrude," Jonathan said, his tone measured. "But she doesn't look well. She needs medical attention." The man's lip curled in a sneer. "She's fine," he snapped. "Better off than when I found her. Now get out before I make you." Jonathan hesitated. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in the man's eyes told him this was a fight he wouldn't win. Not here, not now. He glanced back at the girl one last time, her glowing eyes pleading silently with him. "I'll go," he said finally, stepping toward the door. "But this isn't right. You know that, don't you?" The man didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, his cold gaze following Jonathan as he left. Outside, the air felt heavier than before, the night pressing in around him. Jonathan climbed into his car, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. As he drove away, his mind was already working through possibilities. Who was the girl? How had she ended up there? And most importantly, how could he help her? The glow of her eyes stayed with him, burned into his memory like an ember refusing to fade. Jonathan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just leave her there. Whatever it took, he would come back. And next time, he wouldn't leave without her. Jonathan couldn't get the girl's glowing eyes out of his mind. Every time he blinked, they were there, pleading with him, haunting him. The drive back to his small house on the outskirts of town felt interminable, his thoughts racing with questions and fears. Who was she? What was she? And why was she chained like an animal in that wretched house? Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, Jonathan sat at his desk, papers strewn across the surface, flipping through medical textbooks and scribbling notes. None of it helped. The girl, Aria, he decided to call her since he didn't know her real name, didn't fit into any category he'd encountered in his years of study. Her glowing eyes, her shimmering hair, even the strange sounds she made were unlike anything he could explain. Yet the memory of her trembling form, the desperation in her gaze, kept pushing him toward one conclusion. He had to help her. But how? Morning arrived too soon, and Jonathan made his way to the clinic, trying to focus on his appointments. He bandaged a dog's paw, examined a sick cat, and administered vaccines to a litter of puppies, but his mind wasn't in it. Every spare moment was spent replaying the encounter in his head, analyzing every detail. George, if that was even his real name, had been protective of her, but not in a way that suggested concern. He'd acted like she was a possession, something he could control. The very thought made Jonathan's stomach churn. By late afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. He closed the clinic early, citing an emergency, and drove back toward the house. This time, he parked farther away, hiding his car behind a cluster of trees. The woods were quieter than they had been the night before, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Jonathan moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the soft ground. He had no plan, only the gnawing need to see her again, to make sure she was still alive. The house looked even more decrepit in the daylight, its peeling paint and sagging roof a stark contrast to the lush greenery around it. Jonathan crept up to one of the windows, peering inside. The room was empty, save for the same scattered debris he'd seen before. He moved to another window, then another, searching for any sign of her. Finally he heard it, a faint rustling, followed by that same soft whimper. His heart leapt. Jonathan found her in the same room, still chained, but this time she was sitting upright, her glowing eyes fixed on the doorway. When he entered, she flinched, but didn't make a sound. He raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "It's me," he whispered. "Do you remember me?" Her gaze softened slightly, though she didn't respond. Jonathan stepped closer, careful not to startle her. The chain around her ankle looked heavier in the daylight, the metal digging into her skin. He crouched down, examining the shackle. It was old but sturdy, the kind of thing you'd use to restrain a dangerous animal. His jaw tightened. "Can you understand me?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She tilted her head, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. Instead, she made a sound, a series of soft, melodic tones that rose and fell like a song. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. Jonathan frowned, trying to make sense of it. Before he could ask another question, the door slammed open, and George's towering frame filled the doorway. His face twisted with rage as he took in the scene. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" George growled, stepping into the room. Jonathan rose to his feet, his pulse pounding. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jonathan said, forcing himself to stay calm. "But this isn't right. She's not an animal, George. She's mine," George interrupted, his voice cold and final. "And you don't get to decide what's right or wrong in my house. Now get out." Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides, but he knew he couldn't win a physical fight against George. He glanced back at Arya, her glowing eyes wide with fear, then turned to leave. As he reached the door, George's voice stopped him. "If I see you here again," he said, his tone low and menacing, "you'll regret it." Jonathan didn't respond. He walked back to his car, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her there, not like that. But going back would only escalate the situation. He needed a new approach, a way to help her without putting himself, or her, in even more danger. That night Jonathan began his research. He searched for missing persons reports, hoping to find any mention of someone who matched Arya's description. Nothing. He dug into George's background, discovering a string of petty crimes, but nothing that explained his connection to the girl. Frustrated, Jonathan turned his attention to Arya herself, trying to make sense of her glowing eyes and melodic voice. Hours later, he stumbled across an article about rare, undocumented species found in remote regions of the world. Some were humanoid in appearance, with characteristics that defied scientific explanation. Could Arya be one of them? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If she was part of a species unknown to science, it explained why George was so desperate to keep her hidden, but it also meant she was in even greater danger than Jonathan had realized. The more he thought about it, the clearer his path became. He couldn't rely on the authorities, not when they'd likely dismiss his claims as delusional, and he couldn't confront George directly, not without risking both their lives. No, if he was going to save her, he'd have to do it himself. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had no idea how he was going to pull it off, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let her down. Jonathan spent the next few days consumed by the task of unraveling the mystery surrounding Arya. Every free moment was devoted to her, her situation, her origins, and most importantly, how to help her. He knew he was walking a dangerous line. George was unpredictable, a volatile man whose connections to the criminal underworld made him a formidable adversary. But the memory of Arya's glowing eyes, her silent plea for help, was a tether Jonathan couldn't break. Returning to his clinic one evening after a long day of pretending everything was normal, Jonathan locked the door and sat at his desk. On his computer screen were documents he'd pieced together about George. Nothing directly incriminating, but enough to paint a picture of a man who had spent years skirting the law, always staying one step ahead of trouble. Jonathan's stomach churned as he scanned the information. George had been implicated in illegal trafficking before, though the details were vague. It wasn't hard to imagine that Arya was part of something far darker than Jonathan had initially realized. Late that night, he made the decision to go back. He couldn't bear the thought of Arya spending another day in that house, chained and vulnerable. This time he prepared carefully, packing a small bag with tools and supplies. He didn't know what he would encounter, but he couldn't risk going unprepared. As he drove toward the house, the dark woods swallowed the last remnants of twilight, leaving the road bathed only in the pale glow of his headlights. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his nerves on edge. The house came into view, looming like a phantom in the darkness. Jonathan parked his car farther back than before, ensuring it would be hidden from view. With his flashlight in hand, he approached the property, his steps muffled by the soft forest floor. The stillness of the night pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He moved quickly, slipping into the shadows of the house, and finding the same window he had used to spy inside before. Peering through the glass, he saw her. Arya was sitting in the corner of the room, her back against the wall. The chain around her ankle looked heavier in the dim light, and she seemed more fragile than he remembered. Her head was bowed, but the soft glow of her eyes pierced the darkness. Jonathan's breath caught. She hadn't given up. She was still fighting, even if it was just to survive another day. Jonathan moved to the back of the house, where he had seen an old door during his previous visit. The lock was rusty, and with a few careful twists of the tools he'd brought, it gave way. He slipped inside, keeping his movements silent. The house was as decrepit as he remembered, the air thick with the same metallic tang. He navigated the narrow hallways, careful to avoid any creaking floorboards, until he reached the room where Arya was held. When he entered, she looked up sharply, her glowing eyes widening in recognition. Jonathan held a finger to his lips, urging her to stay quiet. He crouched beside her, inspecting the chain around her ankle. It was more secure than he'd anticipated, and his tools wouldn't be enough to break it. He cursed under his breath. "Arya," he whispered, hoping she understood. "I'll get you out of here. I promise." She tilted her head, studying him intently. Her lips moved, but the sounds she made were still unintelligible. Then she raised her hand, tracing a series of symbols in the air with her finger. The glowing lines lingered briefly before fading. Jonathan frowned, unsure of what he was seeing. He reached for his notepad, quickly sketching the shapes. They looked mathematical, almost like equations, but they didn't make sense to him. Arya's glowing eyes met his, and she nodded toward the symbols, as though urging him to understand. Before he could ask more, a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the house. Jonathan froze. Heavy footsteps followed, the unmistakable sound of George's boots pounding against the wooden floorboards. Arya stiffened, her glowing eyes darting toward the door. Jonathan acted on instinct, slipping behind a piece of broken furniture just as George entered the room. "What are you up to now, girl?" George growled, his voice low and threatening. He approached Arya, his eyes narrowing as he inspected her. "You've been awfully quiet tonight. Don't think I don't know what you're capable of." Arya remained still, her gaze fixed on the floor. George muttered something under his breath and grabbed a small metallic device from his pocket. Jonathan's stomach sank as George pressed a button, and Arya let out a sharp cry, doubling over as though in pain. Jonathan clenched his fists, his anger boiling, but he forced himself to stay hidden. Confronting George now would only make things worse. After what felt like an eternity, George finally left the room, slamming the door behind him. Jonathan waited, his heart pounding, before stepping out of his hiding spot. He knelt beside Arya, his hands shaking as he reached for her shoulder. "Arya," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. "I'm sorry. I should have done something." She looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. Slowly, she raised her hand again, tracing another set of symbols in the air. Jonathan watched, captivated, as the glowing lines formed a more complex pattern. This time, he recognized something, a familiar mathematical sequence buried within the strange shapes. It was as though she was trying to communicate through numbers, her only way of bridging the gap between them. Jonathan nodded, pulling out his notepad again. "I'll figure it out," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but I will." As he slipped out of the house and back into the safety of the woods, Jonathan's mind raced with possibilities. Arya wasn't just a victim. She was intelligent, resourceful, and far more than George realized. Whatever those symbols meant, they were important, and Jonathan was determined to uncover their meaning. The fight to save her had only just begun, and he knew there was no turning back now. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he sat in his car, the weight of the plan he had pieced together pressing down on him. He was parked a mile away from George's decrepit house, the darkness outside swallowing the narrow dirt road. The symbols Arya had drawn lingered in his mind, their patterns mysterious but purposeful. Jonathan hadn't deciphered their full meaning, but he was certain they were her way of guiding him. They were a cry for help wrapped in logic, and he couldn't ignore them. He checked his watch. It was nearly midnight, and he knew George would be patrolling the house. From what Jonathan had observed during his brief surveillance, George had a routine, one that left a short window of opportunity. Tonight was the night he would risk everything. The tools in his bag felt heavier than usual, and the flashlight he carried was wrapped in fabric to dull its beam. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Slipping out of the car, Jonathan moved through the forest, his steps careful but determined. The damp earth muted the sound of his boots, and the wind carried faint whispers through the trees. As the house came into view, he crouched low, scanning the property. A single light shone from one of the windows, illuminating the silhouette of George pacing inside. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He didn't have much time. Circling to the back of the house, Jonathan found the same rusted door he had used before. The lock was intact, but his earlier tampering had weakened it. With a quiet, forceful push, it gave way, and he slipped inside. The air was thick, suffocating, the faint metallic scent mingling with the mildew. He moved through the hallways, each creak of the floorboards setting his nerves on edge. His hand gripped the handle of a crowbar tucked into his bag. Reaching Arya's room, he hesitated. The chain binding her had been unyielding during his last visit, but he had come prepared this time. He pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight casting a faint glow over her figure. She was slumped against the wall, her glowing eyes dimmer than before, but they lit up slightly when she saw him. Relief flooded her expression, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "I'm here," he whispered. "We're getting out tonight." Arya tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his. She raised her hand, tracing a quick pattern in the air. Jonathan didn't need to understand its meaning. The urgency in her movements was clear. He nodded, dropping to his knees beside her and inspecting the chain. The rusted metal was thicker than he'd remembered, but he pulled the bolt cutter from his bag and positioned it around the shackle. "It might hurt," he warned her softly, gripping the handles tightly. Arya didn't flinch, her gaze steady as he applied pressure. The bolt cutter groaned, the metal resisting for a moment before snapping with a sharp clang. The sound echoed through the house, louder than Jonathan had anticipated. He froze, listening. Heavy footsteps reverberated through the floor above them. George. "Damn it!" Jonathan hissed. He grabbed Arya's arm, helping her to her feet. She staggered slightly but steadied herself, her grip on his shoulder firm. "We have to move," he said. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Jonathan guided Arya toward the back door, but as they reached the hallway, George's towering figure appeared at the other end, his face twisted in fury. "You!" George bellowed, his voice filling the space. "I warned you!" Jonathan didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted, pulling Arya along with him. George gave chase, his boots thundering against the floorboards. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering light casting ominous shadows. Jonathan pushed Arya ahead, his mind racing for an escape route. They reached the back door, but before Jonathan could open it, George grabbed him by the shoulder and yanked him back. Jonathan stumbled, barely staying on his feet. George swung a fist, but Jonathan ducked, the blow grazing his ear. Adrenaline surged through him as he retaliated, slamming the crowbar into George's side. The man grunted in pain but didn't go down. Instead, he lunged at Jonathan, grabbing the crowbar and wrenching it from his grip. "Get her out!" Jonathan shouted at Arya, his voice strained as he grappled with George. Arya hesitated, her glowing eyes darting between them. Then, something changed. Her expression hardened, and she raised her hand, tracing a pattern in the air with deliberate precision. The symbols glowed brighter than before, their light filling the hallway. George froze, his grip on the crowbar loosening as he stared at the shimmering shapes. "What the—" he began, but before he could finish, a wave of energy burst from the symbols. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to send George stumbling back, his eyes wide with confusion. Jonathan didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Arya's hand and pulled her through the door, the two of them sprinting into the forest. Branches whipped against Jonathan's face as they ran, the cold air burning his lungs. He could hear George shouting behind them, his voice fading as they put more distance between themselves and the house. Arya moved with surprising agility, her steps light despite her earlier exhaustion. Jonathan glanced back, his heart pounding. For the first time, they were free of the house, but he knew they weren't safe yet. They reached the edge of the forest where Jonathan had parked his car. He opened the door and ushered Arya inside, her glowing eyes scanning their surroundings nervously. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine, the roar breaking the silence of the night. As they sped down the road, Jonathan's grip on the wheel tightened. "We did it," he said, his voice shaky. "We're out." Arya didn't respond with words, but her gaze softened, the faintest hint of a smile gracing her lips. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel Jonathan's resolve. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time, hope felt tangible. Together, they would find a way to keep moving, to stay ahead of George and whatever forces he represented. The fight wasn't over, but Jonathan was more determined than ever to see it through. The road stretched endlessly before them, the car's headlights carving a narrow path through the thick darkness. Jonathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding with residual adrenaline. Beside him, Arya sat silently, her glowing eyes fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't spoken or made any sound since they'd escaped George's house. The faint luminescence of her gaze reflected off the window, casting delicate shadows across her face. Jonathan didn't press her to speak. He had no idea how she might process everything that had just happened, but he hoped she understood one thing. She was free now. After driving for what felt like hours, Jonathan finally pulled off the main road and into the safety of a secluded clearing. It wasn't much, a stretch of grass bordered by thick trees, but it was far enough from civilization to give them a moment to breathe. He killed the engine and turned to Arya. She was still staring out the window, her posture tense, her hands resting in her lap. The chain was gone, but the marks it had left around her ankle were still raw, a cruel reminder of her captivity. "We're safe," Jonathan said softly. His voice sounded strange to him, almost foreign. "At least for now." Arya's head turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, he thought she might finally speak, but instead, she raised her hand and traced a glowing symbol in the air. The soft light bathed her face, and Jonathan watched as the intricate shapes formed a pattern he recognized. It was the same sequence she had shown him in the house, the one he still couldn't decipher. This time, though, there was a new urgency in the way she moved, her fingers trembling slightly as she completed the final mark. "I don't understand," Jonathan admitted, his frustration evident. "What are you trying to tell me?" Arya's gaze softened, and she reached out, her hand hovering just above his. Jonathan froze, startled by the gesture. Slowly, her fingers brushed against his, and an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. Images flashed in his mind, disjointed and fragmented, like a broken film reel. He saw stars, swirling patterns of light, and structures that defied the laws of physics. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the connection severed, leaving him gasping for breath. "What was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Arya didn't answer, not verbally at least, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. Whatever she was, whatever her origins, he was beginning to realize she wasn't just intelligent. She was something far beyond his understanding. As the night deepened, Jonathan decided they couldn't stay in the clearing for long. George would be hunting them, and it wouldn't take him long to figure out which roads they might have taken. Jonathan needed a plan, a real plan, if they were going to stay ahead of him. But first, he needed to figure out where to take Arya. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, more to himself than to her. "But I can't do that unless I know what we're dealing with." Arya tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, to Jonathan's surprise, she spoke, or at least she tried to. The sounds that came out were a strange mixture of tones and syllables, fragmented and alien. She paused, her brows furrowing, and tried again. This time, there was more structure to her words, though they were still laced with the melodic quality he'd noticed earlier. Danger. More. Coming. Jonathan's eyes widened. It wasn't perfect English, but it was close enough to understand. The effort it must have taken her to form those words wasn't lost on him. "More?" he echoed. "You mean George? Or someone else?" Arya nodded slowly, then traced another glowing symbol in the air. This one was different, more complex. Jonathan stared at it, trying to piece together its meaning. The shapes seemed to shift as he looked at them, almost as if they were alive. He felt the same warmth from before, the strange connection that bridged the gap between them. This time, the images were clearer. He saw flashes of other people, other beings, each one with the same glowing eyes as Arya. They were confined, trapped in cages or chains, their faces etched with despair. "There are more like you," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Arya's expression hardened, and she nodded. Then she pointed to the car, her intention clear. "You want to find them?" Jonathan realized. The enormity of what she was asking hit him like a freight train. He'd barely managed to get her out of George's house alive. The thought of going up against an entire network of captors, whoever they were, seemed impossible. But the determination in her glowing eyes left no room for doubt. She wasn't just running from her past. She was trying to save others from it. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, but we need to be smart about this. If we're going to help them, we need to know what we're up against." He started the car again, the engine rumbling softly in the still night. Arya settled back into her seat, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. Jonathan didn't know where they were headed yet, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just fighting to protect her anymore. He was part of something much bigger, a fight he couldn't walk away from. As they drove, Jonathan couldn't help but glance at Arya from time to time. She was staring out the window, her face serene but focused. He wondered what she was thinking, what memories or fears might be running through her mind. He wanted to ask, but he knew the words wouldn't come easily, for either of them. So instead, he focused on the road, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. For the first time since this all began, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. They weren't just running anymore. They had a purpose, a mission, and together they would find a way to see it through. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of damp earth as the car rumbled along an isolated road. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of their mission pressing against his chest. The darkness outside was unyielding, interrupted only by the occasional glimmer of moonlight filtering through the trees. Beside him, Arya sat silently, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation in the clearing, but her resolve was palpable. Every movement, every glance, carried a quiet determination that left no doubt in Jonathan's mind. She wouldn't rest until the others were free. The map on the dashboard was marked with a red circle, the coordinates leading to a location Jonathan had pieced together from George's notes. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. According to the documents, this place was more than a holding facility. It was a hub, a nerve center for the network that had captured Arya and others like her. If they could infiltrate it, they might find the answers they needed, and maybe even the means to dismantle the operation altogether. The road eventually gave way to a dirt path, and Jonathan slowed the car to a crawl. Ahead, the faint outline of a structure came into view, a low, sprawling building surrounded by a chain-link fence. The facility was shrouded in darkness, but Jonathan could see the faint glow of security lights in the distance. He pulled the car off the path and killed the engine, turning to Arya. "This is it," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" Arya nodded, her glowing eyes meeting his. There was no fear in her expression, only an unshakable resolve. Jonathan felt a surge of admiration for her, tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. They were walking into a lion's den, and the odds were stacked against them. But he couldn't let her do this alone. They moved quickly and silently, weaving through the dense underbrush that bordered the fence. Jonathan's heart pounded as they approached, each step bringing them closer to the facility. The fence was topped with barbed wire, but a weak point in the corner provided just enough room for them to slip through. Jonathan used a pair of wire cutters to widen the gap, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds to ensure they hadn't been spotted. Inside, the facility loomed larger, its concrete walls stark and foreboding. They stayed low, moving from shadow to shadow, until they reached a side entrance. Jonathan tested the door, but it was locked. He pulled a small toolkit from his bag, working quickly to bypass the mechanism. The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside. The interior was cold and sterile, a labyrinth of corridors lit by dim overhead lights. Jonathan scanned the area, his senses on high alert. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of static from distant security radios. He turned to Arya, who was already studying their surroundings with an intensity that made him pause. "Do you sense anything?" he whispered. Arya closed her eyes for a moment, her hand tracing a familiar pattern in the air. The glowing symbols lingered, their light casting intricate shadows on the walls. When she opened her eyes, she pointed down one of the corridors, her expression urgent. Jonathan nodded, trusting her instincts. They moved quickly, following her lead through the maze of hallways. At one point, they passed a row of cells, each one empty but bearing signs of recent occupancy. Discarded scraps of clothing, chains bolted to the walls. Jonathan's stomach churned at the thought of what had happened here. This was no holding facility. It was a prison. Finally, they reached a large, reinforced door at the end of the corridor. Arya's glowing eyes brightened, and she pointed to a control panel beside the door. Jonathan examined it, his mind racing. The system was more advanced than anything he'd encountered, but Arya stepped forward, her fingers hovering over the controls. She moved with confidence, her hands dancing across the panel in a way that seemed almost instinctual. The door hissed open, revealing a cavernous room beyond. Inside, rows of glass chambers lined the walls, each one containing a figure suspended in a faint blue light. Jonathan's breath caught. There were dozens of them, beings like Arya, their glowing eyes closed, their bodies motionless. The sight was both awe-inspiring and heartbreaking. Arya moved to the nearest chamber, her hands pressing against the glass. Her lips moved, forming words Jonathan couldn't hear, and for the first time, he saw her resolve falter. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of determination and sorrow. "We have to get them out," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Jonathan nodded, his mind already working. He approached the control panel at the center of the room, scanning the interface. It was complex, filled with symbols and commands he didn't recognize, but Arya was beside him in an instant, her hands guiding his. Together they worked to decipher the system, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural. The chambers began to power down one by one, the blue light fading as the figures inside stirred. Some of them opened their eyes slowly, their glowing gazes mirroring Arya's. Others remained still, their bodies too weak to move. Jonathan's heart clenched as he realized the extent of the damage done to them. A sudden alarm shattered the silence, its piercing wail echoing through the facility. Jonathan cursed under his breath, his fingers flying across the controls. Arya stepped in front of the group, her glowing eyes scanning the room. The others were looking to her now, their trust evident despite their weakened states. "We're out of time," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "We need to move." Arya nodded, gesturing for the others to follow. They moved as quickly as they could, Jonathan leading the way while Arya stayed at the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Jonathan's chest tightened. They reached the exit just as the first guards appeared, their shouts cutting through the chaos. Arya turned, her hands tracing an intricate pattern in the air. The symbols glowed brighter than ever, their light filling the corridor. The guards faltered, their movements sluggish as the symbols pulsed and shifted. Jonathan seized the moment, ushering the group through the door and into the night. The forest was a blur of movement as they ran, the cool air biting at their skin. Jonathan didn't stop until they reached the clearing where he had parked the car. The group huddled together, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars above. As the adrenaline faded, Jonathan looked at Arya. She was standing apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He approached her, his voice soft. "You did it," he said. "You saved them." Arya turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time there was a glimmer of peace in her expression. But Jonathan knew their journey wasn't over. They had won a battle, but the war was far from finished. Together, they would face whatever came next.